Stay near the back tonight, Evelyn. My husband whispered as the valet opened the car door beneath the glowing entrance of the Grand Meridian Hotel. These people are executives, investors. You probably wouldn't feel comfortable around them anyway. I smiled softly and nodded as if his words didn't settle somewhere deep inside my chest like cold rain. The December wind swept across Fifth Avenue, carrying the sound of traffic and distant sirens through Manhattan, while couples in black tuxedos and glittering gowns disappeared beneath the gold-lit entrance ahead of us. Thomas adjusted his bow tie in the reflection of the car window, without even looking at me. At 68 years old, I had spent almost 4 decades standing beside that man through every season of his life, but lately, I had begun to feel less like his wife and more like something inconvenient he carried quietly behind him. I stepped carefully onto the sidewalk, smoothing the navy blue gown I had altered myself at our dining room table just 2 nights before. The fabric was old, but elegant enough if the light didn't hit it too harshly. Years ago, Thomas used to tell me blue brought out my eyes. Tonight, he barely glanced at me at all. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of guests moving through waves of music and laughter. Champagne glasses sparkled beneath the soft amber lighting, while waiters carried silver trays through clusters of executives and socialites. The entire room smelled faintly of roses, expensive perfume, and polished marble. It was the kind of night Thomas once dreamed about when we were younger and struggling to pay rent in our tiny apartment in Brooklyn. Back then, I worked double shifts at a pharmacy while he finished business school at Columbia. I still remember falling asleep at the kitchen table beside stacks of unpaid bills while he studied financial reports across from me. We used to promise each other that if success ever came, we would enjoy it together. Somewhere along the way, together quietly disappeared. Evelyn, stay here for a moment, Thomas said as we entered the ballroom. His hand touched the small of my back only long enough to guide me toward a table near the far wall beside the catering station. I need to speak with some people first. Before I could answer, he was already smiling at a younger woman approaching in a silver dress that shimmered beneath the chandeliers. She couldn't have been older than 35. Tall, flawless, confident. I watched Thomas lean closer as he introduced her to a group of investors near the center of the ballroom, laughing in that polished corporate voice I barely heard anymore at home. Nobody asked who I was. Nobody looked in my direction twice. I sat quietly near the back of the room, folding my gloves carefully in my lap while an orchestra played soft jazz near the stage. Every now and then, I caught pieces of conversations drifting through the air. Market shares, luxury properties, private flights to Aspen. Thomas moved effortlessly among them like he belonged there. And maybe he did. The strange thing was, years ago, I would have been proud watching him succeed like this. Tonight, all I felt was invisible. A server offered me champagne, but before I could take a glass, another guest stepped directly in front of me without apology, reaching past my shoulder as though I were part of the furniture. I lowered my hand slowly and looked down at the tablecloth instead. That was the moment I realized Thomas hadn't introduced me to a single person all evening. Not one. I told myself not to be sensitive, not to ruin the night with old woman emotions, as Thomas sometimes called them lately whenever I asked why he worked so late or why he stopped holding my hand in public. Across the ballroom, I saw him again beside the younger woman, his face brighter than I had seen it in months. Then suddenly, the music seemed quieter. Conversations began fading one by one near the entrance. Heads turned toward the grand staircase overlooking the ballroom floor. A tall silver-haired man in a black tuxedo had just entered the gala surrounded by board members and security staff. Even from across the room, I recognized him instantly. Jonathan Hale, CEO of Hale International, one of the most powerful men in the country. Thomas had spent months preparing for tonight in hopes of securing his company's merger deal with Hale Industries. I watched Thomas straighten immediately, almost nervously, as Jonathan moved through the crowd shaking hands. But then something unexpected happened. Jonathan stopped walking. Completely. His eyes moved slowly across the ballroom until they landed directly on me. For one strange second, the entire room seemed frozen beneath the chandelier light. Then Jonathan Hale smiled softly, like a man who had just found something he'd been searching for a very long time. And before anyone could understand what was happening, he started walking straight toward my table. The sound of Jonathan Hale's polished shoes against the marble floor echoed softly through the ballroom as every conversation around us seemed to dissolve into stunned silence. I could feel people watching now, not because of me, but because one of the most powerful businessmen in America had suddenly abandoned an entire circle of executives to walk toward a woman sitting alone near the catering station. My fingers tightened slightly around my gloves as Jonathan stopped beside my table, his expression warmer than I could understand. Up close, the years showed faintly around his eyes, but there was still something unmistakably sharp about him, the kind of presence that made entire rooms adjust themselves around a person without being asked. "Evelyn Carter," he said quietly, almost like he was afraid the moment might disappear if he spoke too loudly. "I cannot believe it is really you." I stared at him for several seconds, trying to understand how a man like Jonathan Hale could possibly know my name. Around us, the ballroom remained painfully still. Even the orchestra had softened into near silence. "I am sorry," I said carefully. "Have we met before?" A small smile touched his face then, not arrogant or rehearsed like the smiles I had seen all evening, but genuine. 38 years ago," he replied, "in a snowstorm outside Pittsburgh. My car broke down on Route 79, and I was too proud to admit I had nowhere to go." My breath caught softly in my throat. Suddenly, I remembered. Not the billionaire standing in front of me now, but a frightened young man sitting inside a tiny roadside diner wearing a wet wool coat and counting dollar bills with shaking hands while the storm buried the highway outside. I had been 29 years old then, driving home from visiting my mother in Ohio. Jonathan had looked exhausted, embarrassed, and desperate enough that I quietly paid for his meal without telling him. When I learned the motel nearby had no vacancy, I gave him the last $40 in my purse and let him sleep in my old Buick for the night while I stayed awake inside the diner drinking burnt coffee until sunrise. Back then, $40 had been almost our entire grocery budget for the week. Thomas had been furious when I told him afterward. "You are too trusting," he had said at the time. "People take advantage of women like you." I never saw Jonathan again after that winter morning. At least, I thought I never had. "You saved me," Jonathan said softly now, his voice carrying just enough that the people nearest to us could hear. "You treated me with dignity at the exact moment I had none left." Across the ballroom, I saw Thomas standing completely frozen beside the younger woman in silver. His face had lost all color. Jonathan turned slightly toward the crowd before looking back at me again. "I spent years trying to find you," he continued. "The diner closed long ago. The town records were incomplete. I only knew your first name and that old Buick with Ohio plates." I let out a faint nervous laugh because none of this felt real anymore. Around us, executives who had ignored me all evening were suddenly staring as though I had transformed into someone else entirely. A woman near the center table whispered something urgently into her husband's ear while several board members exchanged confused glances. Jonathan noticed the untouched champagne glass in front of me and frowned slightly. "Why are you sitting back here?" he asked. Before I could answer, Thomas finally hurried toward us, forcing a strained smile onto his face so quickly it almost looked painful. "Mr. Hale," he said, extending his hand too eagerly. "Thomas Carter. We met briefly last quarter during the merger conference in Chicago." Jonathan looked at the hand for only a second before shaking it politely. "Of course," he replied. "You are Evelyn's husband." Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten unexpectedly. Not Thomas the executive. Not Thomas the investor. Just my husband. For the first time all evening, I saw uncertainty flicker behind Thomas's carefully controlled expression. Jonathan turned back toward me again, his voice gentler now. "There is someone very important I would like you to meet tonight, Evelyn. But first," he said, offering me his arm in front of the entire ballroom, "I think it is time you joined the front of the room where you belong." Every eye in the ballroom followed us as Jonathan Hale guided me away from the back corner of the room and toward the center tables beneath the chandeliers. I could feel it happening all around me like a sudden shift in temperature. People who had not acknowledged my existence 30 seconds earlier were now stepping aside politely, smiling too quickly, adjusting their posture as if they had misjudged something important. My heels moved carefully across the marble floor while the orchestra resumed, playing soft piano music somewhere behind us. I had attended enough corporate dinners during Thomas's career to recognize the sound of social panic. Wealthy people always became nervous when they realized someone important valued a person they had overlooked. Jonathan walked beside me calmly, completely unaware of the storm he had created. Or perhaps he understood it perfectly. As we approached the center of the ballroom, a woman in an emerald gown immediately stood up from one of the premium tables. "Please," she said with a tight smile, motioning toward her seat. "Mrs. Carter should sit here." 10 minutes earlier, that same woman had glanced directly through me while speaking to another guest about luxury resorts in Italy. I thanked her softly and sat down beside Jonathan while waiters appeared almost instantly with fresh champagne and silver place settings that had not existed at my old table near the kitchen doors. Across from me, Thomas remained standing awkwardly beside the younger woman in silver, both of them uncertain whether to approach or disappear. I watched him attempt to recover his confidence the way he always did during difficult meetings, straightening his shoulders, smoothing his tie, smiling too much. For years, Thomas had built his entire life around controlling how people perceived him. Tonight, for the first time in decades, he looked completely unprepared. Jonathan noticed him lingering nearby and gestured politely toward the empty seats at our table. "Please join us," he said. Thomas hurried forward immediately, almost relieved to be invited. The younger woman followed behind him, though now her confident smile seemed strained around the edges. "Mr. Hale," Thomas began carefully after sitting down, "I had no idea you and Evelyn knew each other." Jonathan turned toward him with calm curiosity. "Your wife never mentioned me?" Thomas gave a short laugh. "Well, Evelyn has always been modest." The answer settled strangely in the air between us because it was not entirely true. I had mentioned that winter storm years ago. More than once, actually. But Thomas rarely listened to stories that did not help him move forward professionally. Small kindnesses interested him less than ambitious plans. "Your wife changed the direction of my life," Jonathan said quietly. "Most people walked past me that night pretending not to notice. She treated me like a human being." I lowered my eyes toward the tablecloth because hearing gratitude spoken that sincerely after so many years felt unexpectedly emotional. Jonathan reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and carefully unfolded a worn piece of paper. Even before he handed it to me, I recognized the faded diner receipt attached to it with yellowed tape. My handwriting covered the back, directions to the nearest auto repair shop, and a note telling him not to lose hope because difficult seasons eventually passed. I stared at the paper in disbelief. "You kept this?" I whispered. Jonathan smiled softly. "For 38 years. Around us, several executives had gone completely silent listening to the conversation. I noticed the younger woman beside Thomas glance at me differently now, no longer dismissive, but cautious. The entire evening had quietly reversed itself in ways none of us expected. A waiter refilled my water glass before I even realized it was half empty. Another guest leaned toward me asking if I had ever traveled to Napa Valley, because Jonathan's charity foundation hosted an event there every spring. People suddenly wanted my opinions, my stories, my attention. It should have felt satisfying, but instead, a strange sadness settled over me, because none of this recognition had appeared until someone powerful decided I mattered. I looked toward Thomas for a moment. He was staring at Jonathan with forced concentration, trying desperately to understand how the wife he had hidden at the back of the ballroom had somehow become the most important woman in the room. The rest of the evening unfolded like a dream. I could not fully step inside. Conversations kept shifting toward me no matter how hard I tried to redirect them elsewhere. Men who had spent years discussing mergers and investment portfolios with Thomas were suddenly asking me where I grew up, how long I had been married, whether I enjoyed New York or preferred quieter places outside the city. Women who had barely acknowledged me earlier now complimented my dress, my earrings, even the way I spoke. I answered politely, but somewhere beneath my calm smile, an uncomfortable truth kept pressing against my chest. None of these people had changed because they suddenly saw me differently. They changed because Jonathan Hale did. The orchestra transitioned into softer piano melodies while dinner was served beneath the glow of enormous crystal chandeliers. Silverware clinked gently against fine china, and waiters moved carefully between tables pouring wine that probably cost more than our first apartment rent decades ago. Across the ballroom windows, Manhattan glittered in the winter darkness like another universe entirely. Jonathan remained beside me through most of dinner, occasionally introducing me to board members, charity directors, and executives whose names regularly appeared in financial magazines. Yet despite his enormous influence, there was something strangely humble about the way he spoke to me. He listened carefully. He remembered details. He treated every answer I gave as though it mattered. I had almost forgotten what that felt like. At one point during dessert, Jonathan leaned back slightly and smiled. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to repeat your note to myself during the hardest years." I looked at him with confusion. "My note." He nodded and unfolded the faded diner receipt again. "Difficult seasons eventually pass," he read softly from the back. "But kindness stays with people long after survival does." Heat rose unexpectedly behind my eyes because I did not even remember writing those words. Back then, I was simply a tired woman trying to help a stranger during a snowstorm. I never imagined a single act of kindness could survive almost 4 decades. Thomas sat unusually quiet beside us through most of the conversation. Every now and then, I noticed him trying to contribute something professional about market forecasts or expansion strategies. But Jonathan always seemed more interested in speaking to me instead. The imbalance unsettled Thomas more with every passing minute. I could see it in the way he kept adjusting his cufflinks and checking the room around him. For years, Thomas had been the center of every social event we attended. Tonight, for the first time, he had become secondary in his own world. The younger woman in silver barely spoke anymore. She sipped her wine carefully, avoiding direct eye contact with me now. Somewhere between the appetizers and dessert, the confidence she arrived with had quietly disappeared. Jonathan suddenly turned toward Thomas with calm curiosity. "How did you and Evelyn meet?" The question seemed simple enough, but Thomas hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "College," he answered finally. "Well, technically after college. We met at a fundraiser in Philadelphia." Jonathan smiled faintly. "And you knew immediately she was extraordinary?" Thomas laughed lightly, though the sound felt strained. "Evelyn has always been very supportive." Supportive. The word settled heavily inside me. Not intelligent. Not strong. Not compassionate. Supportive. I lowered my eyes toward my untouched coffee for a moment as memories quietly surfaced one after another. Working overnight pharmacy shifts while Thomas studied. Selling my mother's jewelry to help cover his first business loan. Missing holidays because he needed help preparing presentations. Smiling through years of loneliness because success always seemed one promotion away from finally bringing him peace. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person with dreams and slowly became the foundation beneath his. Jonathan studied Thomas carefully for several seconds before speaking again. "A man is fortunate," he said slowly, "when life gives him someone who believes in him before the world does." The silence after that sentence felt heavier than anything spoken all evening. Thomas forced another smile, but this time it barely reached his eyes. And for the first time in years, I realized something quietly devastating. My husband had spent decades building a powerful reputation in rooms exactly like this one. Yet somehow a stranger remembered my value more clearly than the man I gave my entire life to. By the time the dinner plates were cleared away, the ballroom had transformed into something almost unrecognizable to me. Earlier that evening, I had been sitting alone beside a service station, hoping not to embarrass my husband by speaking too loudly or standing in the wrong place. Now people approached our table one after another asking Jonathan if he would introduce them to me. It all felt strangely unreal, like watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. A woman from the charity board complimented my composure. Another guest asked where I had learned to speak with such grace. I nearly laughed at that one because there was nothing glamorous about the life that shaped me. Grace came from surviving difficult years quietly, without letting bitterness destroy you. Jonathan seemed to understand that without needing it explained. As the orchestra shifted into slower music and couples drifted toward the dance floor, Jonathan turned toward me again with that same thoughtful expression he had worn all evening. "Evelyn," he said gently, "there is something I have wanted to ask you for many years if I ever found you again." Thomas immediately straightened in his chair beside me. I could feel his attention sharpen like a wire pulled too tight. "Next spring," Jonathan continued, "my foundation is opening a national mentorship initiative for women rebuilding their lives after financial hardship and personal loss. We have executives, attorneys, and educators involved, but what we truly lack are people with integrity. Real kindness. I would like you to join the advisory board. I blinked in surprise, genuinely unsure I had heard him correctly. Me? I asked softly. Jonathan smiled. Especially you. The table fell silent. Even the younger woman beside Thomas stopped moving completely. I stared down at my hands for a moment, suddenly aware of how ordinary they looked beneath the ballroom lights. Small signs of age along my knuckles. The faint silver scar near my thumb from years of handling pharmacy inventory boxes. These were not the hands of a wealthy socialite or polished executive wife. They were simply the hands of a woman who had spent most of her life taking care of other people. I do not have experience with foundations, I admitted quietly. Jonathan leaned back slightly. Experience can be taught, he said. Character cannot. Something inside my chest tightened painfully at those words, because I could not remember the last time anyone had spoken about me with that kind of respect. Not admiration for what I did for others. Not appreciation for supporting someone else's career. Respect for who I was. Across the table, Thomas finally spoke after remaining unusually quiet for most of the evening. That sounds like an incredible opportunity, he said quickly, though his smile looked carefully controlled now. Evelyn has always been wonderful with people. Jonathan glanced toward him politely. I imagine she has been wonderful at many things people failed to notice. The sentence landed gently, but the meaning behind it cut deeper than any raised voice could have. Thomas lowered his eyes toward his wine glass without answering. Around us, music floated softly through the ballroom, while couples moved beneath the chandeliers, laughing quietly together. For years, I used to imagine evenings like this would eventually bring Thomas and me closer once all the hard work paid off. Instead, somewhere along the climb, he began looking at me less like a partner and more like evidence of the life he no longer wanted attached to his image. The realization no longer hurt the same way tonight. It simply felt clear. Jonathan turned back toward me again. There is a private luncheon at the Foundation headquarters tomorrow afternoon, he said. I would be honored if you attended as my guest. Before I could answer, Thomas spoke again almost too quickly. Unfortunately, Evelyn and I already have plans tomorrow. I looked at him in surprise because we had no plans at all. Jonathan noticed the expression on my face immediately. So did Thomas. A heavy silence settled briefly between us before Jonathan smiled politely. Well, he said calmly, I suppose Mrs. Carter can decide for herself. It was such a simple statement. So ordinary. Yet hearing someone acknowledge my ability to choose my own life after years of being quietly managed by my husband felt almost overwhelming. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I realized I did not actually need Thomas to speak for me anymore. The atmosphere around our table shifted again after Jonathan said those words. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly enough that everyone nearby seemed suddenly aware something important had changed. Thomas forced another polite smile, though I noticed the muscle tightening along his jaw. For years, he had controlled nearly every social situation simply by being the most confident person in the room. Tonight, confidence no longer belonged to him. It sat calmly beside me in the form of a man who remembered kindness instead of status. Jonathan continued speaking with guests and board members while I sat quietly absorbing the strange weight of the evening. Every now and then, someone approached to introduce themselves to me personally. One woman from Boston told me she admired how composed I seemed under pressure. Another guest asked if I had always lived in New York. I answered gently, still feeling slightly detached from the entire experience, as though I had stepped accidentally into someone else's life. Across the ballroom, photographers captured images beneath the chandeliers, while servers carried trays of tiny desserts through the crowd. The orchestra transitioned into softer string music, and couples drifted toward the dance floor once more. It should have been beautiful. In many ways, it was. Yet somewhere beneath the elegance, I could feel Thomas unraveling quietly beside me. He began interrupting conversations more often, laughing too loudly at comments that were barely amusing, correcting small details nobody cared about. I recognized the signs because I had spent 37 years smoothing over his insecurities before anyone else noticed them. At one point, Jonathan excused himself briefly to greet several international investors near the stage. The moment he stepped away, Thomas turned toward me sharply for the first time all evening. His voice remained low and controlled, but I could hear tension underneath every word. You could have mentioned you knew Jonathan Hale. I looked at him calmly. I did mention it, I replied softly. Years ago. He frowned immediately. No, you mentioned helping some stranger during a snowstorm. You never said he became one of the richest men in the country. The answer settled heavily between us, because we both understood what he actually meant. If Jonathan had remained poor, the story would never have mattered to him at all. I folded my hands carefully in my lap. I did not think his bank account was the important part. Thomas exhaled slowly through his nose, glancing around to make sure nobody nearby was listening. Evelyn, this merger deal is extremely important to me. You need to be careful not to say anything that could create misunderstandings. For a moment, I simply stared at him. Not because his words shocked me, but because suddenly I could hear our entire marriage inside that single sentence. Even now, after everything that happened tonight, his greatest concern was still how this affected him. Before I could answer, the younger woman in silver leaned slightly toward Thomas. I think Jonathan is coming back, she whispered nervously. Thomas immediately straightened. His posture again, replacing irritation with polished professionalism so quickly it almost felt rehearsed. Jonathan returned carrying 2 champagne glasses and handed one gently to me. I hope I am not interrupting, he said politely. Not at all, Thomas answered too quickly. Jonathan studied both of us for a brief moment, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He was intelligent enough to read tension without anyone explaining it. But if he noticed the strain between us, he chose not to embarrass me by mentioning it. Instead, he turned toward me again with the same warmth he had shown since recognizing me earlier that evening. There is one more thing I never told you, he said softly. The night you helped me, I had already decided to give up on everything. I was driving home to tell my father I had failed. I listened quietly while the ballroom noise faded into the background around us. Jonathan smiled faintly at the memory. You treated me like my life still had value before I believed it myself. Something tightened painfully in my chest because I realized no one had spoken to me that way in a very long time. Not as someone useful, not as someone supportive, but as someone valuable simply because of who I was. And sitting there beneath all that crystal and gold, I suddenly understood something heartbreaking with perfect clarity. The woman Jonathan remembered from 38 years ago still existed. I had simply spent too many years beside a man who slowly taught me to forget her. The gala continued long past the point where most evenings would have exhausted me, yet I barely noticed the passing hours anymore. Something inside me had quietly awakened beneath those chandeliers, something I thought age and disappointment had worn away years ago. It was not pride exactly, and it certainly was not revenge. It felt more like remembering myself after being invisible for too long. Jonathan remained nearby for most of the evening, though he never hovered or performed his kindness for attention. That was perhaps what affected me most. Every gesture from him felt natural, respectful. When another executive interrupted me mid-sentence to ask Jonathan a question about international markets, Jonathan gently redirected the conversation back toward me without hesitation. Evelyn was telling us about Philadelphia in the 70s, he said calmly. I would like to hear the rest. Such a small thing. Yet I could not remember the last time someone made space for my voice so deliberately. Thomas noticed it too. I saw the growing frustration behind his carefully controlled expression every time another guest approached our table asking for my opinion or inviting me to future charity events. Earlier that evening, he had wanted me hidden near the back wall where nobody important would notice me. Now those same people seemed more interested in speaking with me than discussing quarterly earnings reports with him. It unsettled him in ways he could no longer disguise. The younger woman in silver eventually excused herself from the table entirely after spending most of the evening quietly observing the shift around us. Before leaving, she offered me a polite smile that looked almost apologetic. I returned it gently because suddenly I understood something that had taken me decades to learn. Women often become cruel to each other inside rooms designed to measure their value by youth, beauty, or status. But the true problem had never been her. It was the kind of world that taught women to compete for scraps of respect from men who barely noticed their sacrifices. After she left, Thomas leaned closer toward me while Jonathan spoke with another board member nearby. You are enjoying this a little too much, he murmured quietly. I turned toward him slowly. Enjoying what? His jaw tightened. Do not pretend you do not understand. For several seconds, I simply looked at him beneath the soft ballroom lights. The strange thing was, I no longer felt intimidated by his disappointment. For years, one cold look from Thomas could ruin my entire evening because I spent most of my marriage trying to avoid becoming difficult, embarrassing, emotional, inconvenient. But tonight, sitting in the center of a room where I was finally being treated like a person instead of an accessory, something inside me had grown unexpectedly calm. I am enjoying being spoken to respectfully, I answered softly. I had forgotten what that felt like. The words landed harder than I intended. Thomas stared at me in complete silence. Across the ballroom, laughter drifted beneath the chandeliers while cameras flashed near the stage. Nobody around us noticed the quiet fracture spreading between two people who had shared almost 4 decades together. Thomas lowered his voice further. You are making me look foolish in front of people who matter. I felt something inside me finally settle into place then. Not anger, not heartbreak, just clarity. Thomas, I said gently, if kindness from another person makes you feel small, perhaps the problem is not me. He leaned back slightly as though the sentence physically stunned him. In all our years together, I had almost never spoken to him that directly. Not because I lacked thoughts of my own, but because I spent too many years believing peace required my silence. Jonathan returned to the table moments later carrying coffee for both of us, completely unaware he had arrived in the middle of a quiet ending neither Thomas nor I had fully acknowledged yet. I hope I did not keep you waiting, he said warmly as he placed the cup beside me. Not at all, I replied softly. And for the first time in many years, I realized I was no longer afraid of disappointing my husband by becoming visible. The gala slowly began winding down as midnight approached, though clusters of wealthy guests still lingered beneath the chandeliers with glasses of champagne in their hands. Outside the ballroom windows, snow had started falling softly over Manhattan, covering the city streets in silver light. The orchestra played one final arrangement near the stage while waiters quietly cleared empty plates and folded linen napkins from the tables. It should have felt like the end of an ordinary evening. Instead, it felt like the closing scene of a life I no longer recognized. Jonathan stood beside me near the ballroom balcony overlooking the skyline, while guests continued stopping him every few minutes for handshakes and photographs. Yet somehow, despite the endless attention surrounding him, he always returned his focus calmly back toward me. I spoke with the board chair during dinner, he said softly. They would be fortunate to have you involved. I let out a quiet breath, watching snow drift past the glass outside. You barely know me anymore. Jonathan smiled faintly. Sometimes one decent act tells you more about a person than years of social performance. Behind us, I could feel Thomas watching from across the ballroom. Not speaking, not interrupting, just observing the strange distance growing between us, one silent moment at a time. Earlier that evening, he had wanted me hidden near the back wall because he believed I did not belong among powerful people. Now he looked at me like someone trying desperately to understand how he miscalculated so badly. The painful truth was that nothing about me had changed tonight. The only thing that changed was who decided I deserved to be seen. Jonathan turned slightly toward me again. There is another reason I hope to find you someday, he admitted quietly. After my company became successful, I established scholarship programs in Pennsylvania and Ohio under anonymous donations connected to your note. I looked at him in surprise. My note, he nodded. The line about difficult seasons passing stayed with me through every failure I survived afterward. I wanted young people struggling financially to hear the same thing from someone who understood hardship. For a moment, I could not speak at all. I thought about the younger version of myself sitting inside that tiny roadside diner during a snowstorm, exhausted from working overtime shifts and worried about overdue utility bills. Back then, I never imagined anything about my life would matter beyond simply surviving 1 month at a time. Yet somehow, a small act of compassion had traveled farther than I ever did. Thomas finally approached us then, his posture stiff with the kind of restraint people use when trying not to lose control publicly. Jonathan, he said carefully, I appreciate the kindness you have shown Evelyn tonight. Jonathan nodded politely. She deserves kindness. The simplicity of the response seemed to unsettle Thomas even more than criticism would have. He looked toward me briefly before speaking again. We should probably head home soon. Home. The word sounded strange in my chest suddenly. For years, home meant obligation. Routine. Silence stretched carefully across dinner tables while Thomas answered emails beside me without really looking up. Somewhere along the way, our marriage stopped feeling like a partnership and slowly became a role I performed out of habit. Jonathan glanced toward me instead of answering Thomas directly. "Will I see you tomorrow afternoon?" he asked gently. The question hung quietly in the air between us. For decades, I would have automatically looked toward my husband before answering anything that affected our schedule. That instinct still lived somewhere inside me, trained carefully through years of trying not to disrupt Thomas's plans. But tonight, something inside me had shifted too deeply to ignore anymore. I lifted my eyes toward Jonathan and smiled softly. "Yes," I said. "I think you will." Thomas went completely still beside me. Not angry, not dramatic, just stunned in the quiet way people become when they realize control has slipped from their hands without warning. Outside the ballroom windows, snow continued falling gently over the city while the orchestra played its final notes beneath the chandeliers. And standing there between two very different men, I realized I was no longer waiting for permission to become the woman I used to be before marriage slowly taught me to disappear. The ballroom began emptying shortly after midnight, though the soft glow of the chandeliers still reflected across polished marble floors and half-finished champagne glasses. Guests drifted slowly toward the elevators wrapped in cashmere coats and quiet conversations, while snow continued falling beyond the tall windows overlooking Manhattan. Somewhere near the stage, the orchestra packed away instruments one careful piece at a time. The entire evening seemed to dissolve gently around me, like a dream preparing to disappear by morning. Jonathan walked with me toward the entrance of the ballroom, while several board members stopped to shake my hand and tell me they looked forward to seeing me at the luncheon the next afternoon. Every word still felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. For years, my life had been measured by what I gave away to support other people. Tonight was the first time in decades anyone asked what I wanted for myself. Near the coat check, Jonathan paused beside me while an attendant retrieved our things. "I am very glad I found you, Evelyn," he said quietly. "Some people spend their entire lives searching for proof that goodness still exists in the world. You gave me that proof during the worst night of my life." I felt emotion rise unexpectedly in my chest again, but this time I did not try to hide it behind polite smiles or careful silence. "You built your own life?" I replied softly. Jonathan shook his head faintly. "Perhaps, but kindness changes people more than success ever does." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Snowflakes drifted slowly outside the glass entrance while black cars lined the curb beneath the city lights. Then Jonathan smiled warmly and kissed my hand with old-fashioned gentleness before stepping back. "Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, he said. "Do not let anyone convince you that you do not belong there." After he disappeared into the winter night, surrounded by security and assistants, I stood quietly beneath the hotel lights holding my coat against the cold. Behind me, I heard Thomas approach slowly. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. The silence between us felt heavier now because it no longer carried confusion, only truth. "Evelyn," he finally said, his voice lower than usual, "I think tonight got a little out of hand." I turned toward him calmly. "Did it?" Snow swirled softly around the entrance as drivers opened car doors for departing guests. Thomas looked exhausted suddenly, older somehow beneath the harsh glow of the hotel lights. "You know how these corporate events are," he continued carefully. "People get caught up in appearances. I never meant to make you feel unimportant." I listened quietly because years ago those words would have relieved me instantly. I would have accepted them without question just to restore peace between us. But standing there now, after an entire evening, spent remembering who I used to be before shrinking myself to fit beside his ambitions, something inside me remained still. "Thomas," I said softly, "the painful part is not that you hid me tonight." He frowned slightly. "Then what is it?" I looked out toward the snowy Manhattan streets before answering. "It is realizing you have been hiding me for years." The truth settled gently between us with no anger attached to it anymore. That was what surprised me most. I was not furious. I was simply finished pretending not to notice. Thomas opened his mouth as though searching for another explanation, but no words came. For once, there was nothing left to manage with polished speeches or professional charm. An attendant handed me my coat then, and I slipped it on slowly while Thomas stood beside me in silence. I reached toward my left hand and carefully removed my wedding ring beneath the falling snow. The gold band rested quietly in my palm for a moment before I placed it gently into Thomas's hand. His eyes widened immediately. "Evelyn." I smiled sadly, though not unkindly. "I spent 37 years helping you become someone important," I said softly. "I think it is finally time I remember myself too." Then I stepped away from him beneath the glowing lights of the Grand Meridian Hotel and walked alone into the snowy Manhattan night. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not feel invisible anymore.